The hospital ship had no weapons. That truth echoed through every sensor ping, every diplomatic channel, every silent expectation humanity had clung to for centuries. The vessel drifted at the edge of the Kepri corridor, white hull gleaming against the velvet dark, red and blue medical sigils glowing softly like a promise written in light. Inside, gravity was gentle. Voices were hushed. Machines breathed in careful rhythms. Children from a dozen species slept under translucent blankets, their fevers breaking at last. Wounded aliens lay beside wounded humans, stitched together by hands that did not ask which flag had once flown above their homeworlds. The ship was named Mercy of Dawn. It had crossed 3 war zones without escort, because escort implied threat, and threat implied choice. Mercy had none. Mercy went where it was needed. The Kepri Collective knew this. They had acknowledged the transponder codes, the open medical manifests, the continuous broadcast declaring unarmed humanitarian status in 17 interstellar languages. They had watched the Mercy of Dawn arrive in slow, watched its hangar doors open to receive evacuation shuttles filled with civilians they themselves had displaced, and then they fired. The first impact tore through the pediatric wing. There was no warning scream of targeting locks, no ultimatum crackling through subspace. Just light. Sudden and absolute, punching through layered hull plating designed only to resist micrometeors and radiation. The blast decompressed a corridor where nurses had been floating trays of nutrient gel. Air vanished. Bodies followed. The stars rushed in, cold and merciless. The second shot cored the engine ring. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut in a cascade of thunder. Artificial gravity stuttered, then failed. The ship spun, slow and helpless, its white hull blooming with fire and ice. Inside, doctors grabbed for patients, arms wrapping around frail forms as inertia threw them into walls. An alien surgeon with 4 delicate limbs braced herself over a human child, taking shrapnel meant for someone else. The Mercy of Dawn never sent a distress call. Its systems were too busy keeping hearts beating and lungs breathing with the power it had left. On Earth, the signal arrived anyway. It came not as a plea, but as data. Telemetry frozen midstream. Life signs blinking out in clusters. A medical transponder's calm voice, looping endlessly, declaring humanitarian status to a universe that had just chosen to forget what that meant. The room in Geneva was silent. Screens showed a reconstruction of the attack, every angle calculated, every trajectory mapped. Admirals stood beside doctors. Diplomats beside engineers. No one spoke. No one needed to. Humanity had been attacked before. Colonies burned. Fleets shattered. Cities erased in the early, arrogant years when Earth had believed the stars would welcome them. They had learned restraint then. Learned patience. Learned that survival sometimes meant swallowing rage and signing treaties written in someone else's ink. This was different. This was a hospital ship. A woman at the far end of the chamber closed her eyes. She was not a soldier. She wore no rank. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the table, knuckles white. My sister was on that ship, she said quietly. No one looked away. The Kepri Collective issued a statement 6 hours later. They called it a regrettable miscalculation. A sensor error. An unfortunate coincidence of military engagement near a humanitarian corridor. They expressed conditional sorrow for the loss of life, while reminding the galaxy of their ongoing security concerns regarding human expansion. They did not apologize, they did not offer aid, they did not expect what came next. For 73 years, Earth had been building something in silence, not a superweapon. Not a planet killer or a reality-tearing monstrosity that would announce itself with terror and force the galaxy to kneel. Humanity had learned that fear inspired coalitions, and coalitions inspired extinction. Instead, they built understanding. They mapped alien psychology the way they once mapped genomes. They studied how species perceived honor, loss, and consequence. They learned which cultures valued territory over lives, which valued reputation over victory, which feared shame more than annihilation, and they built a fleet not to conquer, but to answer questions no one wanted asked. The first human ships emerged from jumpspace at the edge of Kepri territory without firing a shot. They were not sleek. They were not beautiful. They were heavy with armor layered like geological strata, bristling not with guns but with sensors, arrays, and something else the Kepri commanders could not immediately categorize. Their hulls were matte black, swallowing starlight, broken only by faint white markings etched deep into the metal. Names of ships lost. Names of cities burned. Names of the dead. At their center drifted a vessel larger than anything Earth had ever publicly acknowledged. It moved with deliberate slowness, like a judge entering a courtroom that already knew the verdict. The Khepri hailed them at last, voices sharp with irritation and forced authority. Warnings were issued. Borders declared. Consequences promised. Humanity did not reply. Instead, the stars themselves seemed to lean closer. The first act of retaliation was not an attack. Every Khepri military network went dark for exactly 30 seconds. In that half-minute, weapon systems powered down. Shields flickered. Navigation data reset to null. On dozens of warships, artificial gravity inverted, throwing crews against ceilings in chaos and terror. Then everything came back online. No damage. No casualties, just proof. The message arrived then, transmitted on every known frequency, encoded in mathematics so fundamental that no sapient mind could fail to understand it. It showed the mercy of dawn. Its interior. The children. The wounded. The moment the first shot hit, then it showed trajectories. Power signatures. Firing solutions traced unmistakably back to Khepri guns. Finally, it showed projections, simulations of Khepri worlds, their orbital infrastructure, their habitats, their fleets. Each model annotated with cascading failures, ecological collapse curves. Starvation timelines. Not exaggerated. Not hypothetical. Calculated with ruthless precision. A simple line of text followed. This is what we can do. Another pause. Another line appeared. This is what we will not do, unless. The galaxy watched, breath held. The Khepri High Command convened in panic. Some argued for immediate counterattack, pride screaming louder than reason. Others saw the truth hidden in the restraint. Humanity had reached into their systems, touched every vital nerve, and withdrawn without tearing anything apart. That was not weakness, that was control. Still, old instincts die hard. A Khepri strike group jumped toward the human fleet, weapons hot, convinced that preemptive violence was the only language predators understood. They never reached firing range. Space around them folded, not in the violent wrench of a jump, but in smooth, impossible curves. The ship slowed, then stopped, suspended in a web of gravitational fields so finely tuned they could not be escaped without tearing the vessels apart atom by atom. Human ships glided closer, hull-mounted projectors activated, casting images directly into the void between fleets. Not threats. Not weapons, faces, doctors. Nurses. Medics. Human and alien alike. Recorded logs from the mercy of dawn, saved redundantly in data cores that had survived the attack. Final moments of care. Of whispered reassurances. Of hands held as the universe went cold. The Khepri crews watched in stunned silence as an alien child, one of their own, smiled weakly at a human nurse and squeezed her finger with a clawed hand. Then the feed ended. A final message appeared, simple and devastating. We heal, we remember, we respond. The gravitational web released, the Khepri strike group fled, across Khepri space, consequences unfolded with surgical inevitability. Supply depots found their inventories misaligned by fractions that compounded into shortages. Financial networks experienced delays that eroded confidence and sparked internal unrest. Border worlds lost access to non-essential luxuries, then essential imports, then hope. No cities burned. No planets cracked, but the Khepri collective began to fracture under the weight of its own choices. At last, a delegation arrived. They did not come in warships, but in a single, unarmed diplomatic vessel, its hull painted in the muted colors of mourning. They requested audience not with Earth's generals, but with its civilians, so humanity welcomed them into a hall filled with light. Names were projected along the walls, scrolling endlessly upward. Not just human names. All names. Every life lost aboard the mercy of dawn, rendered equal in death as they had been in care. The Khepri representative struggled to stand beneath that silent monument. When they spoke, their voice trembled. Mandibles clicking in grief and shame, they acknowledged the attack, they accepted responsibility, they asked what price would be demanded. The answer came not from a politician, but from a doctor who had once volunteered on a hospital ship and still wore the faded patch on her sleeve. You will build 10 more, she said. Hospital ships. Crew them with your best. Send them where the suffering is worst, even if it is not your own. You will protect them with your lives. And you will teach your children why. The Khepri bowed, a gesture they reserved for their dead. The galaxy exhaled. Years later, the Mercy of Dawn Memorial drifted where the ship had fallen, a ring of light and stone visible from every major transit lane. Pilgrims passed by in silence. Hospital ships of every design and species altered course to salute as they went. Human fleets still patrolled the stars, quiet and watchful, their power undiminished. But it was not their weapons that made the galaxy careful now. It was the knowledge that when humanity chose to retaliate, it did so not with rage, but with memory, and with a moral weight heavier than any bomb, because some lines, once crossed, do not invite war. They invite judgment, and humanity had learned how to deliver it. In the cold vastness between stars, a simple truth echoed, carried by ships that healed instead of destroyed. Mercy was their message, but never mistake it for weakness. The galaxy did not forget. In the months that followed, silence spread outward from Khepri space like a held breath. Trade lanes adjusted their courses. Patrol routes widened. Long-established powers recalculated what they thought they knew about humanity, replaying the footage again and again, studying not the ships or the technology, but the restraint. The refusal to annihilate. The choice to educate through consequence rather than extinction. For many, that choice was more frightening than open war. Human hospital ships multiplied. They appeared near famine worlds, plague-ridden habitats, and border systems abandoned by their own governments. White hulls returned to the stars. Brighter than before, protected now by unspoken consensus. No one fired on them. Not because of treaties. Because every species understood what that act would awaken. Yet the universe has never been ruled by wisdom alone. Beyond the mapped reaches, where ancient empires slept behind dead suns, something stirred. It had watched the rise of humanity with distant curiosity, the way one observes a spark drifting through vacuum. But the attack on the Mercy of Dawn, and what followed, drew its attention fully at last. The archivists of Thren were older than most stars with names. They had catalogued civilizations by the tens of thousands, recording their birth, their peak, their collapse. Patterns were comforting. Aggression led to escalation. Mercy led to conquest. Empathy was a weakness exploited until nothing remained. Humanity did not fit. The archivists sent a probe, then another. They watched Earthships halt wars without firing, watched them dismantle tyrannies by unraveling logistics instead of dropping fire. They observed how humans mourned not only their own dead, but everyone else's, as if grief itself were a shared inheritance. This was unacceptable. The probe did not return. Human analysts noticed the gap instantly. Space had a way of revealing absence more loudly than presence. Deep-range sensors detected a shadow where none should exist, a distortion not of mass, but of intention. Something was moving through known space without touching it, sliding between the rules like a thought slipping between neurons. The first contact was not an attack, it was an erasure. A listening post on the edge of human territory went silent. Not destroyed. Simply gone. No debris. No energy spike. The stars behind it visible as if the structure had never existed. Then another vanished, and another. The archivists were pruning. They did not issue demands or declarations. To them, humanity was a statistical anomaly in need of correction. A species that refused to behave properly threatened the stability of every predictive model they had ever trusted, so they reached for the one lever that had never failed. Fear. A message appeared simultaneously in every human system, from colony relays to personal implants, injected with a precision that bypassed all known security. It contained no language, no symbols. Only images. Earth, cracked open like a geode. Oceans boiling away into space. The moon shattered into a ring of debris. Mars reduced to ash. At the end, a single concept pressed directly into the human mind, unmistakable and cold: conform. Or be removed. For the first time since the Mercy of Dawn, Earth trembled, not with panic, with anger. Humanity had been threatened before. By conquerors, by machines, by gods that demanded worship in exchange for survival. Each time, the response had evolved. Sharper. Smarter. Less forgiving. This time, the response was quiet. No fleets mobilized. No counter-threats broadcast. Instead, Earth's oldest institutions convened alongside its newest intelligences. Philosophers debated beside quantum tacticians. Artists and ethicists were consulted alongside generals. The question was not how to defeat the archivists, it was how to answer them, because destruction was easy, understanding was harder, and humanity had learned, painfully, that what you destroy teaches nothing to those who come after. The first human ship entered Thren space alone. It was not a warship, it was a library. Its hull was transparent, layered with shifting light that displayed fragments of human history as it moved. Cave paintings dissolved into cityscapes. First rockets gave way to orbital rings. Scenes of war faded into scenes of rebuilding. Loss bled into learning. The archivists intercepted it immediately, space warping as colossal constructs emerged, their forms too complex for organic minds to fully parse. They expected resistance, they received an open channel. The library spoke without words, it transmitted records of human failure. Genocides. Slavery. Worlds scarred by greed and fear. It did not hide the shame. It emphasized it. Then it showed the long, brutal struggle to do better. Laws rewritten. Cultures reshaped. Power restrained by conscience, again and again, often imperfectly. Often too late. Finally, it showed the mercy of dawn. The archivists attempted to sever the transmission. They could not. Human technology did not overpower theirs. It sidestepped it, exploiting assumptions baked into Thren systems millions of years ago. Assumptions that no civilization would ever willingly expose its own sins to an enemy. The archivists recoiled, processing something they had not catalogued in eons, a species that defined itself not by dominance, but by responsibility. More human ships arrived, still unarmed, carrying not weapons but archives. Music. Literature. Testimonies from 1,000 worlds touched by human aid. They did not beg for survival, they offered context. For the first time in recorded cosmic history, the archivists hesitated, their models began to fail. If humanity was destroyed, the pattern would hold. Another anomaly erased. Another line completed in the endless ledger of extinction, but if humanity was allowed to persist, something unpredictable might spread. A dangerous idea. That power could be paired with restraint. That mercy could coexist with strength. The archivists understood danger when they saw it. They also understood legacy. Deep within their ancient structures, debates unfolded at speeds that bent time. Some argued for immediate erasure. Others, fewer but growing, questioned the purpose of preservation itself. What was the point of cataloging a universe that never learned? At last, a decision emerged, not acceptance, but trial. A single condition was transmitted to Earth, this time shaped gently into human language. Demonstrate that your way does not end in collapse, prove that mercy scales, survive what comes next. Far from Earth, beyond any map threat, stars began to go dark, not destroyed, silenced. Something older than the archivists had noticed the disturbance. Something that fed on order, on civilizations that grew too interconnected, too hopeful. It drifted toward known space like a tide of forgetting, erasing complexity wherever it passed. The archivists withdrew their fleets. They would observe. Humanity watched the dark advance and understood the truth with chilling clarity. This was not a battle meant to be won with force. This was a test of everything they claimed to be, and the stars were about to find out whether mercy could hold against oblivion. Sometimes, the strongest shield is the courage to protect everyone even when the universe itself is watching. The darkness did not arrive like an invasion. It came as absence. Systems on the frontier stopped. Transmitting without warning, their final signals cut mid-sentence, mid-thought. Automated beacons reported perfect stability seconds before vanishing entirely, as if reality itself had quietly closed a door. Charts updated in real time, stars dimming not through explosion or collapse, but through something more unsettling, forgetting. Humanity named it the null tide, not because it was empty, but because it left nothing behind that could be measured. Where it passed, complexity unraveled. Artificial intelligences lost cohesion, their self-referential loops collapsing into static. Biological organisms did not scream or burn, they simply slowed, cell processes degrading into simpler states until life gently, mercilessly, ceased. It was entropy with intent, order reduced to raw potential. The archivists observed from a distance, their ancient sensors recording the phenomenon with professional awe and private dread. This force was not in their catalogs. It predated them. It had consumed civilizations whose ruins no longer existed even as memory. Against it, weapons were meaningless. Against it, even survival felt arrogant. On Earth, evacuation plans were drafted and discarded within hours. There was nowhere to run that the null tide would not eventually reach. This was not a storm you fled. It was a horizon that advanced at its own patient pace. Humanity chose to stand, not with fleets massed in defiance, but with networks woven in purpose. Scientists, theologians, coders, ecologists, poets, anyone who studied systems, meaning, or connection were brought together in a single, living framework. Not a command structure, but a chorus. The question was reframed, not how to stop the null tide, but how to deny it its food. The first insight came from an unexpected place, a hospice worker's log from the Mercy of Dawn archives. In her final moments, recorded without intent to be studied, she described holding a patient as their vital signs faded. She wrote not of loss, but of presence. Of how meaning persisted even as systems failed. Of how connection did not vanish with function. That log changed everything. The null tide consumed complexity, but not relationship. It erased structures, but not significance, because significance was not a thing. It was an agreement. A shared recognition that existed between minds. Not within them. Humanity had spent centuries externalizing intelligence into machines, into architectures that could be dismantled. Now, they turned inward. The response was called the lattice, not a weapon, a practice. Across human space, people were asked to participate. Not conscripted. Invited. Billions chose to engage, synchronizing not their thoughts, but their attention. They shared memories, stories, sensations, encoded not as data, but as correlations between experiences. Music played simultaneously across worlds. Children were taught the same lullabies. Scientists and farmers alike contributed fragments of what it felt like to be alive. The lattice did not centralize information. It distributed meaning. When the null tide reached the first lattice-integrated system, something unprecedented occurred. It slowed, sensors showed entropy rising as expected, systems destabilizing, but the collapse refused to complete. Patterns re-emerged from noise, not through computation, but through resonance. Ships whose AIs had gone dark found their crews still capable of coordinated action, guided by shared intuition rather than command prompts. The null tide recoiled, not in fear, in confusion. The archivists leaned closer, ancient curiosity flaring into something like astonishment. They had believed meaning to be a byproduct of structure. Humanity had inverted the equation. Structure was optional, meaning was not. As the darkness pressed on, humanity did not fortify borders. They opened them. Alien species were invited into the lattice, their songs, myths, and rituals braided into the growing web. Differences did not weaken it, they enriched it, adding layers of interpretation the null tide could not flatten. For the first time, the galaxy felt. Together, worlds that had never trusted each other shared moments of vulnerability. Old enemies found themselves humming the same melodies, remembering the same stories, holding on to the same fragile hope. The null tide advanced more slowly now, its edge uneven, fraying where connection was strongest. It lashed out, entire systems were erased in sudden surges, regions where the lattice had not yet taken root. The losses were devastating. Humanity mourned them openly, adding grief itself into the shared network, refusing to let even absence be isolated. Grief became glue. At the heart of the lattice, Earth pulsed like a steady drumbeat. Not a capital. A hearth. The Mercy of Dawn Memorial became a focal node, its endless list of names serving as an anchor for remembrance. Each name was spoken somewhere, by someone. Every day, the null tide reached the memorial's edge. It stopped, there, in the cold void where light bent strangely around the monument. The darkness hesitated. Its formless edge rippling as if encountering resistance it could not categorize. No mass opposed it. No energy field blocked its path, only memory, only care. The archivists broke their silence. They did not speak to Earth, they spoke to the galaxy. For the first time, they altered their own archives, adding a new classification where none had existed before: civilization type, resonant, description incomplete, observation ongoing. The null tide remained, vast and dangerous, but no longer inevitable. It could erase systems, but not the bonds between them. It could consume matter, but not the choice to remember. Humanity did not declare victory, they never had, they simply continued to hold the line in the only way that mattered: together. quietly, stubbornly alive, because some forces can devour stars, but even they can choke on a universe that refuses to forget itself. The universe adapted, it always did. The null tide, denied its easy consumption, began to change its behavior. Where it once flowed like an indifferent current, it now probed like a thinking thing, testing the edges of the lattice for weakness. It learned which systems still relied on hierarchy, on isolation, on command chains that could be snapped. Those places it erased without hesitation. Humanity watched and learned faster. The lattice was no longer just human. It breathed with alien rhythms now, layered with perceptions that experience time, identity, and self in radically different ways. Insectoid collectives added swarming intuition. Silicon-based minds contributed patience measured in millennia. Nomadic species brought stories designed to survive loss, carried orally across generations. Meaning became multidimensional. Where the lattice touched, societies changed. Governments loosened their grip. Militaries redefined their purpose from domination to protection. Children were taught not just history, but responsibility. How every action echoed outward, strengthening or thinning the shared weave. The archivists began to feel something unsettling. Their observation arrays, once pristine and detached, now registered interference not from energy, but from relevance. Their own records, perfectly ordered, fell thin beside the living, evolving memory the lattice represented. For the first time, they questioned whether preservation without participation was a form of decay. The null tide made its boldest move. Instead of erasing, it copied. Entire star systems reappeared at its trailing edge, ghostly reflections of what had been lost. Planets without warmth. Cities without inhabitants. Perfect structure, utterly devoid of story. It was a mockery of survival, an attempt to prove that existence without meaning was sufficient. Humanity did not attack the copies, they grieved them. Across the lattice, silence spread as billions paused to acknowledge what had been taken. Names were spoken. Songs were sung softly, without audience. The copied systems began to destabilize, their borrowed order collapsing under the weight of unfulfilled purpose. The null tide faltered again. At last, it did something it had never done before. It reached out, not with force, but with inquiry. A pressure settled across the lattice, a vast, impersonal question pressing against every shared connection. Why persist? The answer did not come from Earth alone, it came from everywhere. From a Kepri medic who now served on a hospital ship of their own making. From a human child who had never known a galaxy without the lattice and could not imagine living for herself alone. From an archivist submind that had begun secretly adding annotations to ancient records, noting not just outcomes, but reasons. The answer was not efficient, it was not logical, it was alive, because existence, shared, is worth the effort. The null tide slowed to a near halt. Its vastness remained, but its hunger dimmed, uncertain what to do with a universe that refused to be simplified. The archivists made their final entry. They reclassified humanity not as an anomaly, not as a threat, but as a catalyst. A force that altered trajectories not through dominance, but through connection. They opened their archives at last, allowing others to write within them. The galaxy changed. Not into peace. Not into perfection, into continuity, and in the quiet dark where the mercy of dawn memorial still drifted, light bent gently around names that would never fade. The universe did not end, it learned. Time passed, but not evenly. In some regions of space, centuries of healing unfolded in what felt like a single breath. In others, old hatreds lingered, slow to release their grip. The lattice endured through it all, not rigid, not perfect, but resilient in the way living things always are, bending, repairing, growing stronger at the scars. Humanity changed most of all. They no longer saw themselves as newcomers to the stars, nor as defenders standing alone against cosmic cruelty. They became stewards of continuity, quiet custodians of a shared memory that spanned species and worlds. Their fleets evolved accordingly. Warships were still built, but everyone carried sanctuaries within, gardens, archives, places of healing, reminders etched into steel that power existed to protect, not to erase. The null tide remained at the galaxy's edge, vast and patient, no longer advancing, no longer retreating. It lingered like a question that had not yet found its final answer. Sometimes, faint ripples passed through it, as if it were listening still, absorbing fragments of meaning it could not fully digest. Children were born who had never known a galaxy without the lattice. They grew up speaking multiple languages, not just of sound, but of feeling. They learned to sense the emotional weather of distant systems the way ancient humans once sensed the coming of rain. To them, empathy was not philosophy. It was infrastructure. On distant worlds once hostile to Earth, human hospital ships docked without ceremony. Their white hulls were no longer symbols of daring defiance, but of trust earned slowly, carefully, over generations. The name Mercy of Dawn was carried forward, reused again and again, not as a relic, but as a promise renewed. The archivists transformed quietly, their great structures still orbited dead stars, but inside, their records changed. Where once there had been only dates of collapse and extinction, there were now annotations of resilience. Accounts of cultures that failed and tried again. Footnotes describing acts of kindness that altered outcomes in ways no model had predicted. They no longer merely watched, they participated. When a new civilization reached its first trembling steps into space, archivist envoys arrived alongside human ones, not to judge, but to listen. To offer caution without condemnation. To share the long view without crushing hope beneath it. The galaxy grew denser with life, trade flourished, but so did art. Vast collaborative works emerged, music composed across light years, stories written by 1,000 minds. Each voice distinct yet harmonious. Even grief evolved, becoming communal rather than isolating, shared before it could fester into bitterness, and still, the memory of the hospital ship endured. Every cycle, across known space, a moment of silence was observed. Not mandated. Chosen. In that moment, ships powered down non-essential systems. Cities dimmed their lights. Voices hushed. Not in fear of what humanity could do, but in respect for what they had refused to do. The null tide stirred faintly during those silences, its edge shimmering as if unsettled by the collective pause. It did not advance. It did not feed, it waited, perhaps for humanity to fail, perhaps to learn. No one claimed certainty anymore. Certainty had nearly ended everything once. Instead, there was vigilance, humility, and the quiet confidence of a species that had faced the void and answered not with annihilation, but with meaning. Far from Earth, at the center of an unassuming star system, a new monument was constructed. Smaller than the Mercy of Dawn Memorial. Simpler. It bore no names, only a single inscription, translated into every known language and several that were not spoken, but felt. We chose to remember. And as long as that choice endured, the darkness would never truly be alone. The test was never over. The universe had simply grown quieter about it. Signals continued to ripple through the lattice, subtle fluctuations felt more than measured. They carried no threat, no demand, only the faint pressure of attention. The null tide was still there, vast beyond comprehension, no longer a force of pure erasure but something altered by prolonged exposure to meaning it could not dissolve. It began to change. Where its edge once flattened everything into silence, small irregularities formed eddies of persistence where traces of structure clung stubbornly together. Not life, not yet, but potential. The archivists detected it first, their ancient instruments registering something dangerously close to curiosity within the void. Humanity noticed soon after. Exploration vessels approached the boundary not with weapons charged, but with open holds filled with archives, gardens, and living crews rather than drones alone. They transmitted not commands or data bursts, but stories, simple, unoptimized accounts of survival, love, regret, and choice. The null tide did not recoil, it listened. In places where the stories lingered, matter behaved differently. Particles formed brief, stable relationships before drifting apart again. Time itself seemed to hesitate, stretching just enough to allow complexity a foothold. The darkness was not consuming these regions, it was practicing. The realization unsettled even humanity. They had not defeated a cosmic force, they had influenced it. The archivists convened in their deepest sanctum. A space older than language. Their conclusion was unprecedented. The null tide was not an enemy in the traditional sense. It was a corrective mechanism, a cosmic reset that activated when complexity lost coherence. For eons, it had known only collapse. Now, it had encountered continuity. This demanded a new role. Across the galaxy, the lattice adjusted instinctively. Connections deepened, not in number, but in sincerity. There was less noise, less performative unity, more deliberate care. Humanity learned that resonance required maintenance, that meaning could not be automated without losing its texture. On Earth, children were taught about the hospital ship not as a tragedy alone, but as a turning point. A moment when cruelty forced a choice, and that choice reshaped the universe's trajectory. They learned that moral weight could bend even cosmic law. At the mercy of Dawn Memorial, something unprecedented occurred. A shimmer appeared within the ring of names, faint at first, like heat haze against the stars. It did not obscure the inscriptions. It traced them, following each curve and line with reverent precision. Sensors failed to classify it. No energy signature matched. The shimmer persisted, then, slowly, it expanded outward, forming a gentle boundary around the memorial, an island of stability within the larger darkness. Not imposed or offered, the null tide had learned the shape of a boundary that did not dominate, but protected. The galaxy felt it, not as triumph, but as relief. The archivists recorded their final amendment. The universe does not end in silence, it ends in what we choose to carry forward. Humanity continued on, not as saviors, not as rulers, but as participants in a cosmos that now understood a new principle, that memory could be stronger than entropy, and care more persistent than oblivion. The stars burned on, imperfect and temporary, and for the first time, that was enough.